Which one is? All right. Hold on. I'm sitting here with Matthew, better known as Mr. Prudentialist on Twitter. Let's bring him up here. We're going to talk today about a wide variety of things. Matthew, or Mr. Prudentialist, what MP perhaps?
Sure, I guess. Depends. I've been called Mr. P by a few people, which I've always thought was strange because I associate that with somebody else who has a Mr. P, or he goes by Mr. Patriarch on Twitter. So it's always just strange. Like, how do you call yourself? How do you identify in the weird world of Twitter? But thankfully, I use my face rather than this amphibious visage that most people associate me with.
I was gonna ask about that. It's one of the more distinct profile pictures on Twitter. I have to say, it's kind of seared into my head. It's like an elevated Groiper, maybe. I don't know what you would.
So no, actually, I'll put it on here for a second while we record. So I run a show on my YouTube channel of the same name, The Prudentialist, and I have a show called Prudent Observations, and I cover international relations and foreign policy because that's what I studied in my undergrad. Okay. And one of the people that was my biggest influence was a man named Clemens von Metternich. He was the diplomat of Austria who was really important in setting up the the Congress system, the sort of concert of Europe, as it were, balance of power. To me, a very geopolitical realist. But at the end of all of my shows, because sometimes it can be really dour or dry, I try to make things like what's a brand that sticks with you. So I have this little gimmick at the end, and it's kind of just stuck with me ever since, called Frog of the Week. So I'll always just say, all right, end of the lecture, I'll take your questions, I'll give you the news, but first, here's the newest Frog of the Week, a different species to cover. And I asked someone, I said, hey, can you do a profile picture of like an amphibious Clemens von Metternich? And so that's what it is. I was never like part of the grouping or anything like that. I just thought, a distinguished frog works a lot better because my old profile picture was Edmund Burke. And I like a lot of Burke's writings. I actually think his essays on like beauty and aesthetics are one of the least read things about him. It's actually really well worth your time. Huh. But I was like, I need something more distinct than just old, Anglo, like, 18th century political theorist or whatever, right? So the Clemens von Metternich frog has stayed with me ever since, and I don't see it changing, although I do use my face from time to time.
What is it about frogs that resonates so much with people? It's not. I don't. Do you see a lot of frogs in your daily life?
I do.
Okay.
I live on a 20-acre lot with some family, and there's a pond nearby, so we were actually just changing out and moving some things and cleaning one of our garage areas. And we had found out that there was this large family of like toads that were living underneath the grill, which explained all like the toad detritus and feces all around the place. And I live next to a pond where I do most of my fishing and my fishing videos, and that's surrounded by frogs. But it's kind of funny because I mean the word frog has so many different implications, because you can think, oh, frogs, like those weird Apustaya, helper Pepe frogs, or the groiping, or how someone like Bronze Age Pervert would say like frog Twitter for right-wing Twitter and things like that. And then like most people who are like, I really like frogs, and I'm like, those are more like Tumblr, lefty women with bright dyed hair and SSRI like burnt out eyes and whatnot. So it's like everyone can appreciate frogs regardless of your political or imbibing persuasion, I suppose. But I just think they're neat, as Marge Simpson would say.
Sure. Well, so for those that aren't familiar with you on Twitter, and I don't know what percentage of our viewers are familiar with the dynamics of right-wing Twitter, I guess is what we'll call it. Tell us, kind of, I guess your history on Twitter. I like to ask, when I talk to people on Twitter, I'm always fascinated by kind of when their accounts took off, and like when they, developed relationships with people, or when you feel like you kind of came into your own, because as I said, your account has, it's very distinctively branded, and I do feel like you do a good job of staying on message, or it's well constructed, You're conveying a clear image or message with it. So that's what, that's why, first of all, I wanted to talk to you, but
Well, I'm glad it comes off that way because I've been on Twitter now since October 1st of 2020, and I still don't know what the heck I'm doing on there. I really don't. I'm more of, if someone were to tell you what I do, I'm more of a YouTube, or essayist guy than I am really a Twitter person because, it doesn't matter that I have 20,000 followers on Twitter, but it's just like, and I don't even mean that as a flex or a brag. It's just like,
yeah.
I don't know how the heck that happened. But I mean, so I started actually, like I mentioned, towards the end of 2020, right before the election. And I was, at the time, I was on dialysis. I had kidney failure prior to a transplant. And I was sitting in a dialysis chair getting my blood cleaned and everything. And I was listening to a lot of the people that I now regularly associate with, various YouTube people, Twitter individuals with podcasts. And I thought to myself, well, I could do this. I have a lot of time on my hands to write out a script or to plan out a video or something. And of course, everyone I know who's on YouTube has a Twitter account because that's another, you don't have just one thing. You have to diversify your social media presence. And so I thought to myself, okay, why not give it a shot? Because during my college years, I was always sort of the polite, person that you would ask like a conservative opinion on because it's just that's how it is in a college environment. If you were someone who had even moderately conservative views, like you liked what Charlie Kirk had to say or something, they were like, well, let's ask him for the nice contrarian conservative opinion and then move on with the conversation.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, why not give it a shot? And I've been blessed since then in the videos and the shows and the streams and things that I do to garner an audience. But as for me, I primarily cover a variety of things, primarily internet and digital culture, international relations and geopolitics, and of course, various musings on literature, art, and culture. And, I try to direct people towards how to better themselves. A saying that gets, thrown a lot that I've said before is, I really do want people to realize that there is more to the world than just the online. So when you turn that phone off at night and you don't like the reflection in that black screen of your phone, that means that we've got some stuff to work on. And that's predominantly what I like to focus on, are those core political issues. I mean, America's definitely not in the best place it's ever been in the past. And how do we navigate it in an age where, in Silicon Valley, places like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok all have, people that are trying to make these things as addictive as possible so that our politics just becomes this schizophrenic dialogue experience. And to me, that's a horrifying thing that we have to deal with day in and day out.
Yeah, I've been one thing that occurs to me, it occurred to me this weekend, is when you spend a lot of time in a kind of more rural environment. I live in Nashville, so more kind of a suburban urban environment. I was in Mandeville, Louisiana for the opening of dove season this past weekend. And when it's interesting to step back from Twitter for a couple of days and just kind of immerse yourself in the outdoors or do whatever you normally do, especially when you're surrounded by people that are not kind of connected to you or somewhat alien or maybe not as connected to the news cycle or whatever it is. And when I come back to Twitter after those periods, I'm always like, I always go through a period of just nothing on here makes any sense. It's totally disconnected from reality. Like none of it makes sense. It's bizarre the effect that it has, where it kind of it does seem like it's this distinct realm from the real world in a lot of ways. But as we've seen, it does leak into political rhetoric. It shows up in more mainstream news, etc. I don't know. It's kind of a fascinating dynamic that I don't know that I've fully kind of grappled with. But occasionally I get this kind of like perspective on Twitter and just online discourse in general that I'm like, I like see completely straight through it. I'm like, what are we talking about here? What do you? It's so yeah.
I compare Twitter to maybe like DMT or ayahuasca. I've called social media in the past a digital ayahuasca. Like it's got a, like how light has a wave duality principle to it. I think the internet or our social media, like the digital, has a drug location duality to it. Like we take the psychedelic digital drug, our experience, we plug in, like William Gibson's Neuromancer. And all of a sudden, after taking this drug, we're now on this like digital astral plane. And very much like DMT and all that, I meet real demons when I'm on the internet, because like there are some horrifying things out there I don't recommend people look up or run into.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's sort of the experience. But at the same time, like it's almost, maybe the spice from Dune is a better example, like everyone, the spice must flow and everyone has to get a hold of it. And now we have to make sure that our brains can comprehend it. And these like select few Twitter users know how to change the discourse on the internet, because that was like a really big achievement before Tucker Carlson, for instance, was sacked from Fox News. Like it felt like a monumental achievement to know that like Tucker Carlson just referenced or read your tweet live on the air for his show, because like a lot of his producers did follow us, myself included. I mean, I never had anything read out on his show, but like to know that, hey, Tucker Carlson's people are reading like a select few of conservative right-wing Twitter people, and that you're one of them. That's to me a really important part, that you're part of the discourse or whatever. But I uninstall the app from my phone every weekend as sort of a technological ascesis, because it's like, I know this is bad for me. Marshall McLuhan is definitely right. The medium is the massage. It works your whole body and your brain, and it changes how you alter information. Like I've been in conversations with people off the air or just in real life, and I'm like, they'll say something and I'm like, that's a good tweet. Like, why am I thinking in 240 characters or whatever, like so it does mess with you. It is a drug. It is an addictive substance, and you do want to be mindful of that. But it is also a place where, it has the smallest user base out of almost all the social media platforms. Yet at the same time, it's the most politically powerful, because it is the 24-hour news cycle just turned up to 11, and that's kind of what it is.
Digital ayahuasca is a good way to put it. And I also, I think anyone that uses the app with some frequency has the phenomenon of thinking in tweets. And I think I've effectively deprogrammed some of that for myself recently through concerted effort to, because it makes it harder to meditate more extensively on something if you're constantly churning out takes or something. So I try to confine that to writing that I do in the Pamphleteer as opposed to tweets. Recently, let's talk about something that you wrote recently, which is this. I admittedly have not read the whole piece, but it's about The Martian. And I believe it's kind of an exploration of science fiction as a medium. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to be kind of lamenting the loss of science fiction as this kind of apolitical artistic medium that's been politicized. Or let's tell me more about.
So the article on Substack, which you can find at theprudentialist.substack.com, is called "I Dream of Martian Soil," and I was inspired to write it because there was a late science fiction author here in the United States by the name of James Benjamin Blish, and he wrote a book called The Flying City, and it was his series. But he also did a lot of novelizations of old Star Trek, the original series episodes, and that's how I knew him. And to find out he was also a really big critic of the literary scene. And so this was written posthumously after he died, but he wrote this article sort of criticizing science fiction as the genre of our era, because he had taken the sort of lens of analysis of civilization from the late German philosopher and historian Oswald Spengler. He says it in his article, saying for the United States or the Western world, we're sort of in that winter phase of civilization. Our technology reflects our literature, and that it just shows that we're sort of frozen in time. And so for The Martian, this movie that came out in 2015, I like the movie, for starters, and it's one of my dad's favorite films, as I open up in the piece. But I look at it, and I know it's fictional because NASA's actually doing something, and it's, we landed on Mars, in comparison to the fact that, there's concerns that we don't know how to rebuild, or if we wanted to, we couldn't rebuild the Saturn V rocket. We're trying to get the Artemis program back into working condition after so many times of budget cuts and delays. And for the longest time, we were relying on the Soyuz rocket. So for me, it was not just writing that piece was science fiction really is a reflection of what could be, that we could escape from our current political woes. And I mean, Everyone kind of casually forgets that like Star Trek is actually post-apocalyptic fiction because the Third World War happened, and the only way we overcome disease and everything is this like millions are dead, and we've come up with this like way of like classless utopianism. But again, it illustrates that we can escape these things, and so science fiction, as James Blish writes, is the reflection of our time in this sort of later epoch of our civilization, and that we may not escape. And I mean, he was a man who'd been involved really since the beginning. You know, he was with the Futurarians back in the 1930s, and he was just looking around. In 1975 is when he died. He was just like, we may not get, you know, we may not escape, but who knows what'll come from it. So he's like, science fiction won't be the grand epics. It won't be remembered like the Epic of Gilgamesh or something. So to me, those are the kind of things that interest me. I'm a deep fan of science fiction, and I originally read that essay on one of the shows that I co-host. It's called The Digital Archipelago. We read it for our audience, and we were really blown away by it. And I was like, I got to write something about this. And one night I was having dinner with my folks, and they were watching The Martian, and it just kind of clicked.
You know, one thing that I think in college I was reading a lot of science fiction. I studied engineering, wireless engineering, and my kind of naive mindset was like, oh, I'm going to read a bunch of science fiction to kind of inhabit the mindset of a scientist. And you know, one of the things you discover is that there back in the, I guess, the 70s, when Asimov and Arthur Clarke and Heinlein were writing, there's kind of, I discovered, I guess, two kind of camps of science fiction writers. There's you know, positivists like Asimov and Clarke, who believe that humans are capable of understanding everything in its entirety through science. And then there's like this small class of writers like Philip Dick and Stanislaw Lem, the Polish sci-fi writer, who kind of embrace the incompleteness of science and its attempts to reckon with reality. That was my probably core, you know, I don't know, an important insight for me during school when I was reading a lot more than I am now. Have you read much of Dick or Lim's work?
I haven't read much of Philip K. Dick. I've read more of Asimov than I think the average Joe has. I actually quite like the Foundation series.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah, I like it, and it's good science fiction, and I'm kind of like heartbroken to know that I think HBO has the rights and they've done a show with it, and I'm just know that it's going to get butchered.
Yeah.
In the same way that I quite like Robert Heinlein, and even the responses that Heinlein got from Joe Haldeman in the Forever War. But I mean, you know, the thing about like the difference between like you said, I think it's a really good divide, is between positive outlooks for humanity versus more gritty, realistic ones. Because you know, the Foundation, you know, trilogy and those like it have this sort of optimistic view that we can plan out for the future, that we can organize, we can answer problems with science. I mean, the same thing with Andy Weir's book on The Martian. You know, you solve one problem, then the next, and eventually you get to go home. Whereas Robert Heinlein's like, listen, violence is the supreme authority in which all other authority derives from. And he answers the question like, you know, we can go to space, but we're going to go to space and we're going to have swords and guns, and that's how it's going to be.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That gritty realism versus that sort of utopianistic kind of hope for humanity, I think, has always been at the strive of all fiction. And those who criticize the utopianism, I think, end up being the better writers, in my personal opinion. One of the greatest pieces of classic English literature, and it's not even more classic, it's more contemporary, but I think Bleak House is probably one of the best books written in the English language, because Dickens so like clearly like punctuates the sort of like liberal utopianism of his day and the Whigs and of the time, because he's just like telescopic sympathy. Like we care so much about things on the other parts of the world, of the British Empire, and you know, this woman, she doesn't have the capability to even look at her own family, and then she runs and becomes an MP, and things get only worse from there. And those criticisms, I think, highlight still very well to this day, even here in the United States. There is always that telescopic sympathy, and we never have that tendency to look back at home. And even when you look at the conflict in Ukraine or our border, or even things that go on in our own backyard, I think it leads to a really big issue of political literacy. Because I think for the average person, this is why I love to death like small publications, is that there are focuses on the local. And because most people think that their problems are being fought in some large, meta narrative battle for politics in Washington or their state capital. And
Yep.
most of the time it's controlled by the guys who are on the, board of, county commissioner's office or the city manager's office. And they never ever take that into consideration, which is always depressing because most problems do start locally and they think that they got to go to Washington first.
Yeah, that's kind of been, the mission of this publication is to try to inform some more old school civic awareness. It does seem like this. It like I put it a couple of ways. Like part of me thinks that politics in a lot of ways is just another form of entertainment now. I think I saw someone talking about how in the 60s and 70s they expressed a lot of the feelings, the zeitgeist of the time into the music, and now we've expressed it into the news cycle or into politics, and there's this kind of like if we view it as entertainment, then Fox News, CNN, like federal level, DC level politics, that's like the big budget movie that everyone's tuning into. And local politics is like the indie, whatever. Less entertaining. You don't know the characters as well, honestly. And I spent a lot of time covering local politics. The ability of various politicians is significantly less than that of people in DC. It's so there's a reason for that. But yeah, I 100% agree with you that your material world in particular, you see the side effects of politics most aggressively on the local level. And this is actually something that I thought would be good to talk about as far as political platforms go, and that of the GOP
absolutely.
right now. It does seem like if we're looking at the national platform of the GOP, the whole idea of the culture war, this kind of thing, you kind of got into it talking about the meta narrative battles up in being fought on this grand battlefield. I've started to view that in some ways as a means of distracting the base from more potent and maybe useful political ideas or approaches to politics. I didn't know if you kind of had an opinion on that.
Well, I think that the politics as entertainment thing is very true. Like what's who's the name I'm trying to think of off the top of my head? Jon Stewart ruined a whole generation of millennial voters. But I mean, it goes back even earlier than that, because you consider the fact that prior to 1968, politics was a different kind of breed when it came to news and reporting. Because, and this may just be a documentary that has informed my worldview, but once you had William F. Buckley on to debate Gore Vidal, a great liberal writer, to debate on NBC News over the conventions during then in 1968, and you had that big blow up where William F. Buckley's threatening to punch him in his mouth after calling him a crypto Nazi, and you're just like, there's entertainment, and we've never left that since. The Gore Vidal versus William F. Buckley thing, you got Crossfire. Jon Stewart tried to be the enlightened liberal, that this is all kayfabe and all entertainment, and then he did his own form of propagandistic infotainment for 10 years and helped get Barack Obama elected, and now he's trying to do the same thing. But even on YouTube, right, there's very few people that will straight up tell you, hey, this is what's going on in my city, this is what's going on in my state. Instead, it's the more abstract stuff, and I'm just as guilty of that. But I try to purposely remind people, listen, if you're not doing things locally, if you're not networking, if you're not in contact, if you don't know who your local state house representative is, you're not going to make it. As for the national level, it does matter, because the national level does determine where federal money goes, because our form of federalism today is not the form of federalism 100 years ago. We operate under a system of what's called coercive federalism. So where the federal government can just threaten to withhold money if you don't pay along. This is why every state's age for drinking is 21, because they want to lose out on those federal highway authority funds, which help keep the roads going. And so the same thing can apply with education. We saw this most perniciously with Barack Obama and the sort of Dear Colleague letter about sexual assault. And that's when you had the whole rape culture discourse go on. Man, that was about a decade ago. It feels like forever ago, doesn't it? Right. And so those are the types of things that, it's important because it does. And I feel like this is something that you have to keep a healthy balance, because the culture war that gets discussed in the media does inevitably come to the local. And sometimes it can even start at the local and explode. This is how much cultural power like California or some new age progressives might have in some areas. And so it does require you to be balanced. But for most people, they'll take the entertainment, they'll take the rhetorical sort of victories, because even on Twitter, right, we're all in these little spheres of influences, or what Walter Lippmann called in Public Opinion pseudo realities. So, now I'm living in a pseudo reality that gives me a 24/7 feed that constantly updates on the discourse, the talking points, the lingo. And as we said, it's a very sort of schizophrenic experience. And, you do need a cadre of people that do focus exclusively on local issues, like Washington be darned, right? Like, I need to know what's happening in Austin. I need to know what's happening in Nashville. But a lot of people they don't consider it outside of when it gets picked up by talking heads, like I saw right-wing pundits or conservative pundits on Twitter calling things the transurrection after the various bills that were passed and had people protesting. I know it happened in Nashville. I know it happened in Oklahoma. And so it's just like, but that's the only reason why they're picking it up, is because, something big happened and they're using it for their talking points about January 6th. Not, well, no, these like crazy people advocate for the mutilation of children, not, oh, they're here protesting. They're here to get their dunks in on Twitter because that dopamine receptor, the button must be pressed. It's not. There's a degree of immaturity to it. Maybe that's the wrong word, but Twitter does create such a level of digital distance that it's easy to like look at something and make fun of it rather than to recognize, no, the law that's being passed here is very serious.
Yeah,
and the fact that we have to debate whether or not children should mutilate themselves without parental consent tells you how bad things have gotten,
right.
not just locally, but as a country. And yeah, the Twitter experience just makes it all the more complicated. And you need a healthy balance of both. I'm sorry that I'm rambling, but it's such a loaded question, because like, yeah, you do need to pay attention to the local, but like, I also have this disgusting burgeoning Leviathan that's ready to like,
Yes,
cast
I
down
know.
a giant sword over my shoulders and split
Yeah.
me in half at any moment. So you need to balance both. And I don't think a lot of people can do that. And as like Lippmann suggested in Public Opinion, I have to rely on others to sort of tell me. And that's why I get excited when I see places like the Pamphleteer, right? Like, oh, a local news organization is going to tell me what's going on in Tennessee. Like, fantastic. I now know what is going on in the state of Tennessee from someone that I can reliably either A, agree with, or B, know to do his due diligence. So
Yeah.
that, that, not to blow smoke or anything, but like, I think that that's important, and I wish more people did that.
To a point you made in there, talking about like local events kind of getting sucked up into the national narrative and then getting branded basically and passed around as kind of like political totems. I kind of like intellectually understood how that's the mechanics of it, but the Covenant tragedy was what like viscerally made me realize that, because that's where I grew up going to church. My dad's an elder there, and have ties to that institution, and I know all the people involved. Was very close to it, and to see that incident just get instantly sucked up into this like slogan machine where they just rebranded it, made it about gun control, completely just refused to reckon with this, the horror of a person entering a school and shooting people. That that's not even worth questioning. We just need to remove the gun, etc. Whatever the case is, it's kind of like not even about the particular incident as for this dynamic as it is about the fact that these events get digested by media and then reproduced to push some narrative or point. It does feel like a lot of these things, the function of media is increasingly to kind of like blunt the natural political impulse of people. I think people are naturally political. I would agree with, I think Aristotle observed that. And I generally agree with that. I mean, politics is in many ways kind of the ultimate question that men settle together. It's how do we live together? How do we organize society, etc. And I think that I think someone is being dishonest if they're saying that they don't have some sort of political impulse. It may not be expressed into electoral politics, but it's probably expressed in the home or the way that they organize their time or whatever. It's this natural latent impulse. Do you think that, like, what I've been trying to think about is how we went from a country where I mean, there's so many easy answers to this question, right?
Yeah.
I think you can probably guess. We probably would have the same ones, but let's humor ourselves for a second and think about what blunted this kind of civic engagement impulse that many people used to have, that increasingly fewer people seem to have, especially conservatives. It does seem like in local politics, it does seem like a lot of the rhetoric coming from media on the right or the GOP is that politics is bad. Like you don't like the media is bad. All these academia is bad, etc. So in a way, it's not really surprising that these people aren't participating in local politics and that kind of thing. But I'm rambling. But like what is has something deadened that impulse, or has it always been the case that the participation in politics has always been kind of very skewed?
I I mean, that's like a big $1 million question that I wish
Yeah.
I had a better historical understanding of political participation to get at. Because before, like we mentioned before we went and recorded this, was that like there's a huge generational and pedagogical like gap between, say, my politics and say like the politics of someone who's considered a conservative at like Harvard, right? Like, no one I know in my immediate circle has read, In Defense of Freedom and other essays by Frank S. Meyer, or has read Russell Kirk, these sort of classic post-war conservatives. But at the same time, people like myself and others will tell you, well, actually, you should like read H.L. Mencken, or you should read Garrett Garrett, who wrote The Revolution Was, which is arguably one of the most important pieces of political treatises ever written at least in the 20th century, because it kind of did highlight that the right in America was holding out against this revolution that was going to like irreparably change the country. And Garrett Garrett was telling them very calmly, it did come in the night of revolution. You were looking on the wrong side of the road, and they were singing songs to freedom while they robbed you blind to pay the collective Peter for Paul. And I mean, that's one aspect, but I mean, I think that it's the impulse is deadened in part because there are certain third rails in American politics I don't think that we're allowed to discuss. And I mean, like a big one, I think, of course, is the aspect of freedom of association. That is effectively dead in this country.
Right.
I mean, even we saw this, even for a safe, non inflammatory example would be the Christian baker in Colorado. He's like, I wish to associate with Christians. I do not want to bake a wedding cake for a homosexual union, which I deem not to be recognized as a marriage in the eyes of God and the church. Okay, great. But they've sued him ad infinitum to ruin his career, to ruin his business, and so on. And it indicates to me that like to freely associate with other Christians is gone. And on top of that, like even on the issues of politics, like there is especially in the waves of immigration that have come into this country. And I mean, even prior to the Immigration Act of 1965, right, you have a very high-low versus middle model of politics where like most of America's Republican voters are white, middle to upper middle class, or sometimes even lower class that, vote for the GOP. And we see this all the time in red states. It's the middle, literal middle of flyover country, as they like to say, versus sort of very populated coastal sections where a lot of capital is located. But they also have not just the geographic sense, but there's also the class and racial sense into it as well, because we saw this, for instance, in the 2012 election, where then Vice President Joe Biden was telling black voters, if Mitt Romney gets elected, he's going to put y'all back in chains. So you have this sort of patron class, client class of African American voters that are told then by Democrats of this various coalition, like, hey, like it's either us or we're going to go back to 1953, where board v. education didn't exist and all that jazz. And it's a very powerful impulse. And to acknowledge that oftentimes gets uncomfortable or it gets awkward. And people are afraid, I think, of those sort of weaponized language. People don't like being called racist. People don't like having, what's that law of the internet where is the longer a conversation goes, someone's going to invoke,
reductio ad Hitler or something.
Yeah, I think it's Godwin's law. The longer an internet convo goes, the higher the likelihood someone's going to get called a Nazi. And so,
yes,
you have a destruction of freedom of association. There are certain things that can't get mentioned, in part because we've kind of criminalized that aspect. Like we know that, like even in churches, right? Even though churches are officially, desegregated, some churches are black churches and some churches aren't, right? And some of those churches are really interesting. I went to one in Atlanta last year, which I thought was an eye-opening experience. But to me, those things definitely play a big role. And so media sort of amplifies the fact that we can't talk about certain things. And I mean, we saw this so clearly, too, to reference that Gore Vidal versus William F. Buckley thing. All it took was Gore Vidal even alluding to the idea that William F. Buckley Jr. was a Nazi for him to go apoplectic and threaten to sock him in his mouth. And which is, I wish he did, but nevertheless, we can't go back to that old caning trick of American politics. Nevertheless, I say that partially in jest, but to me, it indicates that like we're confined in boxes that have then been amplified by both a media apparatus, a mass widespread form of socialization, public education, college, and then finally that there is a legal barrier to a lot of these things that are only just beginning to get discussed. Like, I don't think anyone would have imagined 20 years ago, hey, there are some people on the conservative or right side of politics that are openly talking about the implications of the Civil Rights Act have had. And I mean, it's kind of funny because 20 years ago, Pat Buchanan was writing about this. I was reading, and I just reviewed this book, Where the Right Went Wrong. He published it in 2004, wrote it in 2003. But he was talking about how, Hubert Humphrey, who was a big proponent of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, said, if this ever led to race quotas, I would eat the bill page by page. Well, we had that, and we still have quotas, and we still have ways to keep things artificially inflated for various ethnic representations and classes and whatnot. And that's been a huge debate now over the issues of school choice, charter schools, affirmative action, which the Supreme Court's kind of thrown out now, but not really. And so, to maybe a long story short to this little ramble here, I mean, like, we've got post-war narratives that have totally changed our understanding. Like, we're no longer sort of like this individualist, like pro-business side of things. We're no longer really entrepreneurial. We expect government to have our answers. We have this egalitarian sense of like, listen, no more freedom of association. Like, things are going to be done this way in the name of equity. Now that's been translated into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And finally, that like people are afraid of those labels because if you're on the right, and everyone kind of knows this, even from, the whole Twitter files stuff to more viscerally, even in the UK, people like Nigel Farage being debanked, that, if you go against it, they don't need to throw you in prison. They can just simply make your life a living hell by preventing you from banking or, getting on flights or things like that. So, speaking out against these sort of things has deadened the political impulse of society. And the fact is that Washington, again, go back to that localism versus federal level, because we're so focused on Washington and knowing that if we speak out against Washington or things like that, there are severe, you're either going to be met with deaf ears, or if you do something, there are ways in which things can punish you, or you can get, a hit piece written about you in the Guardian, or the SPLC can be knocking at your door wanting to ask questions. And so it deadens the political impulse, and it sort of instills this beautiful loser mentality, as the late Samuel T. Francis would write, like, I'm never going to win, but my ideas are honorable. So there's something beautiful about that. And that's instilled this learned helplessness in politics that has deadened that impulse to say, actually, no, this is wrong. Because no one's going to scream at the TV outside of a few like bizarre frog-looking people on the internet, right? That says, I want you to be, mad as hell, and I'm sick and tired of it, like that one movie. And so that's the long story short of it. I hope that makes sense.
It did. I thought you clarified some things that I had. I think I was underrating the effect of shaming people with various labels, and I do think that it's kind of a dimension of it that I kind of had not discounted, thinking about like local politics. But even here, like, we have a mayor's race going on right now, and as you'd imagine, just like any other city, there's no MAGA candidate, but the Republican or the more conservative candidate has been labeled, hard right, and had all sorts of epithets thrown at her that are just not accurate descriptions of her at all, purely meant to categorize her in this untouchable camp, And I mean, you have to have thick skin to be able to put up with that. Like, undoubtedly, like, not everyone can just weather those insults, and so it does invite a new type of person into the politics. It's also interesting because it seems like the stakes for politics are higher. And I was reading this book on the history of Central America and kind of the called the Banana Men, and it's about the various United Fruit Company and a couple of other entrepreneurs down there who went and whether it was bananas or whatever other tropical fruit you can grow there, we're shipping them back up to the U.S. And get in all the while getting entangled in the various wars that were going on there. But one of the things that a lot of the Americans that were living down there observed is that in Latin America or Central America, politics is a matter of life and death, whereas in America and Europe of the time, there was politics was not life and death. It was not like this zero sum game. People could come to compromises and agree to disagree and move on, and it was not it was not as cataclysmic as just the unrelenting warfare that characterized Central and South America. And it does seem like, though it hadn't escalated to violence, it does seem like we're in this like permanent state of for cultural warfare, verbal warfare, whatever you want to call it. And I have these discussions, as I'm sure you do, with a variety of people, and some of them are just involved in normal state politics. Some of them are political commentators. Some of them are, whatever. I'll talk with this about anyone. And something that I've started to hear recently with more frequency is people believing that we're, like the history of America is just like I'd imagine any country is. It's this kind of like break up and get back together cycle. These like slow, small revolutions or civil wars that are then, mediated in the courts or at the ballot box or whatever. And part of me thinks that this time is different, but I also know that my bias is that I live in this time, and I didn't actually experience things, in the past that I've read about. So it's very easy, and this is a natural tendency to be like, well, yeah, this time does feel different, but I don't really have anything to actually compare it to. I'm wondering if you have any, like this. I'm not asking the Civil War question, but it does seem like there is something of a natural impasse between people. Like as long as the idea that women, like we can't clearly define what a woman is, I don't see how I can ever enter into a political arrangement with someone that has that viewpoint without serious concessions to my own, self-respect almost.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point. And I feel like there's this like innate desire, especially between maybe more classical liberal or the types like Dave Rubin or James Lindsay, for example, that would say like the left me. Because there's that innate desire to go back in time. Like, things were great in the 90s. Like, why not just remember my childhood? That sort of politics of nostalgia. And I definitely can empathize with it. I wish that were the case, but that it isn't. And so I don't know. I mean, like, it's very funny. For instance, like Tucker Carlson interviewed Donald Trump on his little Twitter program, which it's very weird to listen to like a lengthy 45-minute plus thing on Twitter. Like the
platform's not built for it.
It's not built for it. Tucker, get a YouTube channel or something. But neither here nor there. And like Tucker's asking those questions, right? He's like, well, they've tried indicting you all these times. They've arrested you. If that doesn't work, the logical escalation to that is to kill you. Do you think they're going to kill you, Mr. President? And like Donald Trump is like playing it off very gently. Like, well, the country's pretty good, Tucker. Like the people are great. And, it was like, and then you watch the GOP debate and you're listening to them talk about like education and tax cuts and deficit spending and things like that. And you're like, this is 2012 GOP. This is not this is not Donald Trump. I want the country to stop killing itself GOP, which I feel like we're kind of heading towards that direction. But as for some people make comparisons to the Spanish Civil War, which again, I guess that goes out to that question. But others will compare it to say, the late pagan hours of like the Roman Empire before Christianity became ascendant. I don't know if any of those comparisons are apt, but in part because this is a totally different monster empire. But for me, when you're saying like, well, how do I live in a society where I don't know what a woman is, right? Or where certain people don't, this is where we bring up, and some people don't like him because of his ties to a certain regime in Germany. But then if that's the case, we might as well throw out Martin Heidegger at the same time. But The German political theorist and jurist Carl Schmitt talked about this in the concept of the political. And he says liberalism that we live in, this sort of liberal democratic society, tries really hard to overcome these existential questions and differences to where, yeah, you and I could disagree on things, but like we're both Americans, we love burgers, like we're going to be okay, like we just disagree on this and we'll get them next time, right? If our election doesn't go our way. But, you know, Schmidt kind of points out that that's the fatal conceit that actually doesn't work. We don't smooth over our problems because, I mean, even in the history of our government, right? Like, well, we founded the federal government because we were concerned about having another like tax rebellion. And so under the new federal constitution, immediately afterwards, what do? President George Washington lays down another tax rebellion in Massachusetts in 1789. And it really is indicative of like, well, we've kind of always disagreed on things. But, you know, when I talk to somebody, for instance, who thinks that a man can be a woman, I already know that our political viewpoints are just on a basis. The left likes to use the word ontological, although I don't think they know what that word means. But like on a base, on an a priori level of all of our political observations of first principles, I know that what I believe in exists in anathema to what that guy believes in, and then vice versa. So it's like, well, how do you get along with someone that thinks, you know, all cis straight white men are evil or something, you know, like they're stuck in the politics of 2014 Tumblr where it's like hashtag kill all men or something. Like if they legitimately believe that, how do I exist peacefully with those people? And I don't know if anyone's come up with an answer to that question. And that's sort of the terrifying thing, other than, well, why don't we just separate? But then that goes back to the unfortunate part. Well, freedom of association has been effectively canceled. So now what are you going to do? And that leaves you in that really awkward, precarious position of like, I don't know what else to do other than to take power and rule with an iron fist. And that's why you get all these liberal publications calling Christopher Rufo like a fascist or an authoritarian, despite the fact that Christopher Rufo has openly stated, I am a colorblind liberal, and that is my end goal for this project. And to me, that's the big issue is that like, actually you are going to need to wield power and do it effectively. And the left knows how to do that better than the right does. And they've kind of embraced that Schmittian friend-enemy distinction better than anybody else, because the left knows I'm in power. I may not be in power tomorrow. So I'm going to do everything I can to maintain power for forever. And this is how, you know, you get really great political machines going. I mean, like Jim Clyburn, as old as can be, but like the Jim Clyburn fish fry, or like getting as many people from churches and like community homes to like go out and vote or to harvest ballots, like that's how you win and that's how you maintain power. So I mean, like either you do the same and you start ruling with an iron fist, and Trump did a little bit of that. He did that with the state and local tax write-off in the tax bill when he was president, because he was punishing the left for their tax policies. And everyone was like, well, that's mean. And it's like, no, that's what you should do. You should reward your friends and punish your enemies. The left does this all the time. I mean, that's why there's a big cavalcade of people that are just in and out of media and government and non-governmental organizations and you know, various nonprofits and charities. Like they all go in a certain direction because they all kind of know that it doesn't matter what we disagree on, right? Like that's the beauty of like intersectionality, to throw that term back into the waypoint. Like you manage to find a way to conveniently centralize all sort of progressive issues into one camp. So now like feminists can talk about how, you know, it's feminist to be vegan. And like the vegans can be like, it's environmentalist to be vegan. It makes you a good feminist and it makes you a good ally to, you know, Black, Indigenous people of color in America. And it works effectively to create this like very powerful singularity of progressive coalitions into one giant monster that can just take on anything. And the right doesn't have that, because the right does have that knee-jerk individualist tendency, because it's baked into the American society and culture. And that's why you see this like debate that's sort of coming up again. Because like during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and up into the 1960s, there was an ongoing debate between, say, the more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant like idea of sociology of like, well, people are innately different. They're, you know, we have to be focused on the individual in that respect because we are just different types of people. And then at the same time, you had more Roman Catholic and other individuals that were like, well, we kind of have to embrace a blank slate theory of things. And that's where you got this old debate between like the old right versus sort of the new left in the 1950s and 60s. And it's being replayed again. with sort of the sort of Sohrab Ahmari, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule style of like political Catholicism on the national level versus that old Anglo individualist, let's focus on the family, none of this high church business. And that's when you'll see someone like Sohrab Ahmari write a book called Tyranny Inc., where it's like, I'm a social conservative, I'm a Trinidadian Catholic, but at the same time, I want to get involved and regulate the powers of like the businesses so they can't coerce people to, work long hours under strenuous conditions or things like that. And it's like, but he's also called a conservative. And so it makes you wonder, like, the conservatives of the world in the United States do not have that, like, they don't have right-wing intersectionality. And the last time we tried to do that, it was called fusionism. We're going to bring on sort of that free market-oriented idea of free trade, laissez-faire, with, like, traditionalism of our people. And then that didn't work out because it ended up that conservatives would rather worship the almighty dollar than home and hearth. And so one person's left with their hands in their pockets wondering what to do, while the left just steamrolls everything.
How eating meat is uber Christian or something like what?
Yeah,
I'm
right.
just trying to think of like an intersectionality thing that would work for the right.
Well, there was an article we covered, or I don't know when this will come out, but like today on the 5th of September, the Blaze contributor and show host Oren McIntyre and I covered an article about why it's bad or wrong to prefer your own biological children. And it was a lengthy article just saying, like, actually, if you prefer your own biological children, you're a white supremacist. That was the lengthy gist of the article. And you're just like, that's insane. But like, they legitimately believe that. And they will call you a white supremacist for eating meat, going to church, believing in Christ, and they'll go for it. And that's what we covered. That little article right there. It was absolutely nuts.
That's the video.
Yeah. It's rough.
That's wild. I also just had an idea. Why don't we have a Republican running on repeal the bachelor tax and tax the single women or something like that, or that's a joke, but another one would be
you say that now, but in like in 5 minutes or 5 weeks, someone on Twitter's like, this is a great idea, we should punish single women,
yeah.
Tax them for not being married after the age of 25, like, embrace the ancient city style of morality.
Technically, both single men and women pay something of a bachelor tax on their income, because married couples have, but what was I gonna say? What was I gonna say? We were talking about so one thing, like, speaking of the friend enemy distinction, one like puzzling thing that the GOP could do, and I find this to be kind of an interesting conundrum for the party and its base, is look, the GOP base is largely made up of families with children. And it seems like maybe a good policy proposal would be, let's give another tax break to people with children. Let's give them tax credits for number of children, or some other such thing that would benefit families directly. On the other hand, on the other side of that, you would have people calling that socialism or communism or some variant of that, which I find to be kind of put the GOP in an interesting spot, where its base is willing to call out stuff like that as being, indicating some kind of a communist tendency or a socialist tendency, and willing to say no to it, even if it might benefit themselves. In a way, it's kind of like the liberal version of that is this like kind of racial self-animus, if you're a white person, towards yourself and your race. But on the right, it does seem like the unwillingness to either accept benefits from the government, not in like a totally useless, I'm not going to work and just going to collect welfare checks manner, but or using government to their own benefit. It does seem like that's kind of a similar self-defeating dynamic that the right has.
Well, and that would be the big debate, I think, that's happening with sort of that more common good form of conservatism that does come out of, say, like Ahmari, Vermeule, and Deneen. And that's the criticism that some conservatives have said even against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis about the Disney stuff or firing judges for doing X, Y, and Z that go against the law. I think that wielding state power is what you really should be doing. The question becomes, how effective do you want to run the government? And I mean, like the left, I mean, like it's not even just the left. I mean, it's just like the monster that is Washington, D.C. and the federal government is an unmanageable, untenable mess because Congress has abdicated responsibility for it. But I mean, like, it would be smart, in my opinion, for them to just say, yeah, we're going to pass a law that predominantly benefits our voter base, that like gets rid of, fentanyl from the streets, because most people who die of like opioid overdoses are usually in middle America and tend to be white. We're going to promote family formation. We're going to give tax incentives and benefits to do it. I mean, you kind of see this when people look at like Hungary, and Viktor Orban is a really good example of what they're doing to like promote family formation and incentivize it. But even then, there's only so much you can do on like a federal or policy level to like get people to procreate and have children. But I wish they would just openly say, if elected, I'm going to do things to benefit you. And it's almost as if everyone forgot the lesson of 2016, because 2016 was Donald Trump going down the elevators in Trump Tower in New York City saying, we've deindustrialized, you have been dispossessed politically, also because of immigration, and we want you to have good jobs, and we're going to get criminals and illegal immigrants out of the streets. And, he won in places that no Republicans ever won before. Like, you won Michigan and Wisconsin. We haven't done that since Bush #1. And to me, it was just an impressive sort of level of victory that by talking about things that used to be these sort of old lefty talking points, like actually free trade does hurt us and we need to like reshore American businesses so you can have a factory job and that you can earn and be a breadwinner. Like that was a huge moment for political realignment in this country that like I think most people would want, but the GOP, because it's Donald Trump, no one really wants to do that rhetoric. Ironically, that's what made the GOP debate a few weeks ago so entertaining, because it was 8 people, including Nikki Haley, a woman, but I mean, it was 8 men and women on a stage, all dressed like Donald Trump, all doing the mannerisms of Donald Trump, all trying to be Trump without Trump on the stage. And it was a beautiful performance. I mean, drama school teachers take note, but they all went back to that same softness of, we're going to cut taxes. We're going to give money to Ukraine and Israel. We're not going to do anything about what's happening at home. And it's just like, and these people are clueless, because it's like, there's a reason why 15 to 20% of Bernie Sanders supporters in 2016 went for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Like there's something there in that magical political formula, and they're just tuning the radio in the exact opposite direction. But I mean, I think it's important for us to look at the GOP as the commentator Michael Malice likes to say, progressives driving the speed limit, or better yet, they're just there to lose on purpose. Because it's just like, that's why Trump was such a pain in the rear for them. It's like, this guy came out of nowhere, independently wealthy, didn't care about compromat. Like, he had the whole grab them tape that came out in October 2016, still got elected. And it was just like, wow, like, I mean, he's got his problems, don't get me wrong. I'm not a complete sycophant for the guy, but it was to me like, wow, this was something different. And it wasn't the George W. Bush that I grew up with as a young kid and as a young man, that kind of GOP conservatism. And I wish people would recognize, like, actually, no, you want to incentivize your voter base to survive and exist and thrive, because when they do that, they live for you. And I mean, Donald Trump was the first candidate, and I mean, in a long time, to get more votes in his reelection campaign than he did when he first ran, which usually doesn't happen. Like Barack Obama famously, got the most votes in U.S. history prior to this 2020 election, which that has its own issues. But, he lost votes in his 2012 reelection bid and narrowly beat Mitt Romney. And to me, it was just like, that's impressive for someone who's not of the GOP orthodoxy to gain 17 plus million more votes than he did when running for office. And because if you make the economy good, you reduce immigration, illegal and legal, to its lowest levels in U.S. history and recent history, like, you're going to win and succeed. And that's why they had to get rid of him. That's why they still want to get rid of him.
You did a good job there of reframing what made Trump's appeal so undeniable back in 2016, was that he spoke directly to people's actual concerns and not in these like abstractions about taxes and And at that point, people had heard similar talking points maybe from the left, but they'd been like, just papered over with layers of legalese and bureaucratic just talk and language. And just to tie this back to Nashville as we draw this to an end, our current mayor's race is kind of a mirror of that. You have like an establishment Democrat basically running on bettering people's lives in the city, and you have his opponent being a Republican running on crime and education. And for all of it, this is like the pre-Trump platform dynamic split of what city politics might look like. And for all of the Freddie O'Connell's the progressive candidate, for all of my qualms with him and his platform, which I think is just regurgitating the same things that we've tried in the city for 20 years, which have not done that well. He does speak immediately to people's concerns. In the city, it's not necessarily immigration. It's like, why aren't the potholes filled? Crime in Nashville is not super bad. It's a very segregated city, so the crime and he's talking to his voters who aren't concerned about crime, or if they are, they're just like your standard liberal who thinks it's like endemic to the urban environment. I don't know. That's interesting. I'd completely forgotten about I hadn't thought back on what made Trump so effective in the first place. And it was just this like no nonsense, cut through the bullshit. He wasn't a Democrat running on this. He was just a guy saying, look, these are the problems. We're going to solve them. There was no like papering over it with fancy language.
It was the closest thing you got to Bulworth being real. That old movie with Warren Beatty, and you don't have that. I mean, like I think the big issue in politics, both on a local and federal level for like conservatives or Republican candidates, is that you really need to stop speaking in abstractions. Don't counter signal or don't signal with like, oh, we're going to have good schools and good neighborhoods. Like we know that there's like there's a racialized language to it. Just go past it and say, listen, if I'm elected, these are the things that are going to happen. Your kids are not going to be taught about like sex when they're like, 5 years old. We're going to like make sure that the potholes are taken care of. These things are going to like help reduce the drug problem and criminals are going to be arrested. But no one talks like that. We have to talk about it in ways that is soft language that just speaks to, it's almost as if you're not talking to the base at that point. You're talking to the donor class.
Yes. 100%.
And that's at the end of the day, that's the big problem. Like the Democrats have it easy because they know if they say it to these groups of people, buses of people are going to come out of the woodworks and churches and, being a segregated city, right? Like it's going to be easy. You know who's going to vote for you. Whereas for like Republicans, it's just like speak bluntly and honestly. And when you do get into office, use the big stick that you're carrying to actually whack out a few problems. And until that starts happening on a local and as well as a federal level, conservatives, the GOP and its base will continue to be lambasted, harassed, persecuted, and arrested for ad infinitum.
Yep. Well, this was a great, thanks for coming on the show. Great conversation. If you, to me personally, Pat, and well, I guess I'm on your Substack, so I'm gonna always get stuff that you come out with. You do other appearances like this? You were just on, how do you say his name?
Orrin McIntyre's show on the Blaze, yeah.
Orrin McIntyre's show on the Blaze, which I pulled up. Any other appearances recently that you think worth watching? You've got your whole YouTube channel.
I was about to say I have a whole YouTube channel with a couple hundred videos and streams and lectures on foreign affairs, foreign policy. One of my better essays out there is called Kierkegaard and the Gay Paperclip. So if you want to understand the idea of Kierkegaard's The Leveling and how that applies to progressivism in American politics, you can go look that up on my YouTube channel. It's definitely well worth your time. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I like local papers. I am a big fan of, sort of the local journalists. They're the only redeemable journalists, I think, out there in the world. So keep doing what you guys are doing.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me pull up your YouTube. I'm also going to watch Bulworth tonight. That is a excellent movie that I.
It's a great movie.
Yeah, hold on. I'm going to pull up your just so that they can see it. Let me put it up here. There it is.
Yep.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon. I'm going to shut down the stream, then we can say our goodbyes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening.